Amen. Yesher koach. Guys, you may be seated. And a Shabbat Shalom to you all. Yeah, and even though it's we woke up at 2 degrees today, Purim is indeed coming, and Pesach is coming, and we're in Parshat Bo, where we're reading about the Exodus, the heart of the Exodus. And in our Parsha, we have pressure on Egypt is mounting, the plagues are unfolding, everything is moving towards the sea and towards freedom. So this morning what I want to do is bring our Parsha together with our beautiful Besorah reading today and reflect on what freedom really means. So let's frame this with Yeshua's words from Matthew 7 that Abby just so beautifully read. Enter through the narrow gate. For the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, but narrow is the gate and difficult the way that leads to life. And the gate that leads to life, that's right. And those who find it are few. These are challenging words, aren't they? If you really think of these. So think about this. Did Pharaoh choose the narrow gate or the wide way? You know, clearly he chooses the wide path of destruction, but did he choose it? Did he choose it? Our Parsha opens with a mystery. In 10:1, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe bo el Pharaoh, and Adonai said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh," or Pharaoh in Hebrew, "because I have hardened his heart." See that? I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, so that I might show these signs in their midst, and so that you may tell your son and your grandchildren what I have done in Egypt, as well as my signs that I did among them, so you may know that I am the Lord. It's beautiful, and on the surface, it's very clear. God hardens Pharaoh's heart so that we would have a great story to tell our children for generations and generations. And it's a great story, isn't it? It is a great story. But then just 2 verses later, Moses and Aaron say to Pharaoh, "How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go." Okay, so God hardens Pharaoh's heart and then holds him accountable for it. Does that seem fair? What do you think? Yeah. Doesn't freedom require free will? Even Pharaoh's. Which is it? Is Pharaoh choosing the wide way, or is he a mere pawn, an actor on God's stage? So for us Jews, telling our story of freedom seems to require that we wrestle with Pharaoh again and again and again and again, and maybe wrestle with this question. So I want to reflect on this. Jewish commentators of old wrestle with this question. So Maimonides points out a clear pattern. In the first 5 plagues, Pharaoh actually hardens his own heart in the text. Clearly in the Hebrew. It's an act of free will. And then only later, beginning with plagues 6 through 10, does the Torah say that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. So the first 5 are Pharaoh hardens his heart. Next 5, God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And now, other commentators Maimonides suggests that Pharaoh repeatedly hardens his heart on his own, the first 5, which then closes the door for repentance, and then the next 5 are like a form of judgment. That's Maimonides. Other commentators have a different reading. They note that the Hebrew word kaved doesn't only mean hardened, but it can also mean strengthened. Maybe even better, strengthened his heart. So in that view, God doesn't force Pharaoh to refuse. Instead, he strengthens Pharaoh's resolve, arranging events to play on his pride and giving him the courage to continue down the path that he's already chosen. And if you look at the text, there's some really interesting, we don't have time to go down it now, but there's some really interesting passages where it's like in 5, 6, 7, 8, Moses does interesting things. Pharaoh's like, go. He's like, yeah, but you need to provide the animals. You know, he keeps adding to it and playing on Pharaoh's pride. So in this view, Pharaoh made his choice. And now, rather than giving in simply because he was beaten, the choice is to be exposed for Egypt and Israel and for the world to know that the Lord is God. Now, elsewhere, Maimonides emphasizes that free will is foundational to Judaism. So without free will, the commandments and the prohibitions of the Torah would be meaningless. If human behavior were entirely predetermined, independent of our responses to God's law, there'd be no purpose in revelation or any kind of obligation at all. So the great Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that moral obligation presupposes freedom. If human beings are not genuinely free to choose, then concepts like duty and responsibility and righteousness lose their meaning. C.S. Lewis expresses the same concern more vividly, warning that without free will, we will be nothing more than marionettes or like toy soldiers in the hand of a cruel child playing a game. What do you think of that? I like C.S. Lewis. Free will remain a modern problem. It is something we talk about today. Are the pharaohs of today agents of their own hardening or merely toy soldiers in a drama of history? Shortly after Charles Darwin published On the Origin of the Species, his cousin Francis Galton drew out implications, the darker implications. If we have evolved, then mental faculties like intelligence must be hereditary, and thus our ability to choose our fate is not free, but depends on our biological inheritance. Karl Marx argued that fate is determined merely by economic forces. Sigmund Freud argued that we are who we are because of deep unconscious motivators within. More recent neuroscience tells us how brain chemistry influences behavior, alcohol, antipsychotics, illness, brain injuries. Consider a lobotomy in the 1930s. These all alter a person's entire personality. Are we really more like Pharaoh after all? Only now we don't have a guiding hand pulling our puppet strings in that worldview. Now we're simply lost marionettes moved around by blind, purposeless forces like a toy soldier rolling back and forth in the endless surf on the beach of oblivion. This is a dangerous idea. Recent studies suggest that determinism does something subtle but very dangerous. It obscures the narrow gate of life from view while quietly leading us down the wide path without even noticing. In one study, researchers actually divided participants into two groups. So one group was taught that free will is an illusion, and the other was not. When both groups were given opportunities to cheat, lie, and steal, those who had rejected the free will consistently chose to act immorally over the others. In another study, they measured groups of day laborers and compared workers' beliefs in free will with their job performance. Those who believed that they were responsible for their own actions showed up more reliably and performed better than those who didn't. And it was a better indicator, worldview was a better indicator of performance than any kind of self-professed work ethic. Another study found that students who believed this quote, "Science has demonstrated that free will is an illusion," were less likely to volunteer their time or give to a homeless person than were those who had a belief in free will that was stronger. Isn't that interesting? A diminished belief in free will has also been linked to increased stress, unhappiness, a weaker commitment in relationships. Okay. Here's a quote from Stephen Cave in an article in The Atlantic. "Believing that free will is an illusion has been shown to make people less creative, more likely to conform, less willing to learn from their mistakes, less grateful to one another. In every regard, it seems when we embrace determinism, we indulge our darker side." So when people stop believing they are free agents, they stop seeing themselves as accountable for their own actions. So philosophers like Saul Smilansky, from the Hebrew University in Haifa, have proposed a different approach. Instead of determinism, let's call it illusionism. So the idea here is that society cannot afford for people to internalize the truth about free will. Therefore, it must be confined to the ivory tower. So the uninitiated must be kept in the dark so that we'll maintain the illusion of free will for the public. The irony here, I think, is that if free will does not exist, then there's no reason to preserve the illusion in the first place. The very concern that good or bad outcomes matter already assumes the freedom the theory denies. More ironically still, other determinists criticize Smilansky for encouraging people to live a lie. It's a critique that itself depends on a moral responsibility they claim does not exist. Okay. There's a glaring contradiction that happens in our culture. Let's go to Rabbi Sachs, Jonathan Sachs. Secularists believe, he says, that nothing should constrain our freedom to choose to do whatever we want to do or be whatever we want to be, so long as it does not harm others. Their supreme value is autonomous choice. This is secular humanism. On the other hand, secularists tell us that human freedom does not exist. Why then should we invoke freedom to choose as a value if, according to science, it is an illusion? If free will does not exist, why be bothered by the addictive nature of video games, he says, or social media? Why prefer genuine reality to virtual reality? It was Nietzsche who rightly observed that the greater our scientific achievements, the lower our view of the human person. No longer the image of God, we have become mere incarnated algorithms. So in the end, the secularists and scientists are just about as perplexed about free will as the rabbis of old, wrestling with the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Full circle. And we're still left with Yeshua's words, haunting for some and life-giving for others. Narrow is the gate and difficult the way that leads to life, and few who find it. And those who find it are few, Okay, in the mystical Jewish mind, we have two souls. One is called the Nefesh HaBahamit, the animal soul. Its nature, the animal soul's nature, is towards self, worldly desires, pleasure, fear, and power. You get that? The other is Nefesh HaElohit, the divine soul. In the mystical Jewish tradition, our task is to use the divine soul to master and train the animal soul. And the Torah is the training manual. We train our animal nature when we engage in study and we follow God's laws and instructions in the Torah. Does that make sense? Mystical Judaism has found a home for free will and harmonized the conflict. It's a slave. Our human nature is a slave if left to itself. It's not free will at all. It's a slave to whatever forces most strongly claim the animal self. And our mission in Torah is to use the agency of the divine soul to awaken our sleepy animal soul and draw it through the parting sea, if you will, and into the promised land of freedom. So the space between these two souls is the arena where freedom is won or lost. Now, we're kind of jumping around here. More recent brain science tells us the same thing, but in different terms. We have different parts of the brain, like the amygdala, the limbic system, that govern much of our unconscious life, fear, impulse, emotional reactions, just like the animal soul. And we have a prefrontal cortex where our self-awareness lives. This is where we pause and we weigh consequences and we decide whether or not to listen to the voice of our conscience or to the voice of the Lord. And just like the two souls in mystical Judaism, the tension between these parts of the brain is the arena where freedom is won or lost. Imagine coming over to our house for Shabbat dinner. If you haven't, you're invited. You walk in the door and you smell Raina's chicken and potatoes in the oven. Can you imagine that? Oh. Neuroscience tells us that before you consciously register that smell, before you know that it's chicken, your brain has already decided how you'll feel. The relaxing breath, the softening shoulders, the smile forming on your lips. Our brain can register decisions up to 7 seconds before we're consciously aware of them. Fascinating. So, roast chicken happens before roast chicken happens. See? But just because these decisions and feelings begin unconsciously doesn't mean that they're beyond our control. Research also shows that these patterns are carried along neural pathways, connections in the brain that form over time through repetition and repetition. They get faster and faster and happen earlier the more we do them. They're shaped by what we think and what we rehearse and what we repeatedly do in the routines and rituals of daily life. So some of these pathways are good. A smile when you smell Raina's cooking, for example. But others are not. Paralyzing anxiety triggered by familiar circumstances and trauma. Explosive anger that damages relationships. The more that we return to a particular reaction or an emotion, the more reinforced this pathway becomes. And this is cool. There's actually a substance called myelin, if I'm saying that right. You would know. Am I getting that right? Okay. It's like an insulating sheath which wraps around neural pathways. The more that it's used, it gets stronger. Think of it like insulation around a cable, a wire. And the more it's used, the more that neural pathway is used, the stronger it gets. And that allows more electrical impulses to move faster and more efficiently through the brain. That's why practicing piano works. And it's a fascinating study. You can actually, they did this with monitoring the brain in these neural pathways, playing the piano, and then they did the same thing with someone just imagining their hands moving on the piano, and the same neural pathways were fired and strengthened just by imagining something rather than actually doing that. Isn't that neat? So there's this whole connection. So this is called neuroplasticity. And when we practice anxiety, we do practice anxiety. When we practice anxiety, bitterness, or anger, when we release these scripts in our mind that foster these emotions, then the currents that create these emotions become stronger and stronger. When we repeatedly give in to temptation or live in self-centered ways, those pathways become more and more efficient. This is how we become slaves, and we lose our freedom. And I wonder if this is how Pharaoh hardened his heart at first, and how over time his heart was hardened for him. Choosing another way became harder and harder. In his hunger for power, Pharaoh became one of his own slaves. So I wonder if Pharaoh really did have a choice until he slowly surrendered the freedom to use the choice at all. This is why neuroplasticity matters. It reminds us that there is a conscious, relative, reflective part of the brain in our mind that's capable of shaping our automatic responses and habitual behaviors. It's a game changer. And Judaism has known this for a long time. So here's the life-shaping idea. Free will, then, is something that we truly possess, but not as an absolute. It's something that we must nurture and form. Just as the mystical Jewish tradition teaches that the divine soul must train the animal soul, free will requires conscious effort. The slow work of shaping and awakening our deepest selves from the sleepiness of unconscious life. Returning to C.S. Lewis, he got this before these studies were available, and he reflected on his image of toy soldiers. And he confesses that in reality we are like toy soldiers, but our job, where our agency of free will lies, is to ever so gradually transform a toy soldier into becoming a real human being, modeled and shaped in the image of God. The toy soldier comes to life within us. Again, long before brain science, Judaism understood this at a very deep level. The moment Israel is free, what happens? We're given the Torah, a life of mitzvot, filled with prohibitions and rhythms of life and rituals and instructions. You see, now, to some that's constraining. But what's going on, it's the narrow way. Our arena of agency actually narrows. And in doing so, we're given 1,000 chances every day to be free. Endless moments of choice. Should I do this or that? Should I eat this or should I eat that? Should I feel this way or feel that way? How should I respond? What do I do first thing in the morning? Who do I want to become? These choices shape us into who we will become, you see? So Torah gives us values and principles that we must choose to make our own. An identity that we choose to step into, a people who we must choose to belong to. And then we're given rituals. People who are not free experience God's rituals as constraint. But nestled within the Torah is the secret to freedom. Rituals create space to practice again and again. Actions become routines. Routines become a way of life, a new neural pathway. That way of life shapes us into free people. People who have learned to choose the narrow gate of life rather than drifting down the wide path of Pharaoh's slavery. Now, research suggests that it takes 6 months to form a new neural pathway. 6 months. So consider Shabbat. Shabbat has power because it forces us to consciously interrupt the routines that normally run our lives, to stop a neural pathway. When sundown comes, we're forced to say, enough! We step away from screens, from producing, from earning income, from fixing, and from worrying, and allow the rhythm of our lives to change. And so when we say yes, what's happening in our brain, in our soul, we often come face to face with the anxieties that are so often soothed by the very gerbil wheel that creates them in the first place. And something happens inside of us. Myelin forms over neural pathways that help us to do difficult things and let go. The same pathways that we use to regulate our emotions, happening when we say no to things on Shabbat. The same pathways that bring conscious awareness into our lives. Shabbat helps us wake up, helps us to become more human. And then when we show up together for worship and be with one another, and we form new joy pathways, and brings us into greater freedom. Do you know that there's studies that show that when you meet Harry, when you say hi to Cheryl and you guys light up and your eyes light up and you say Shabbat Shalom, there's like hundreds of microsecond interactions happening in your brain, and you're flashing back and forth, and new neural pathways of joy are like lighting up inside of you. It's like really cool. And relationships where you actually interact with each other are a source of building joy. Joy is actually relational. That's why being together and being together to worship with God, it's like, our brains just go, they light up. And it changes. It gets rid of depression over time and anxieties and does things that are healthy. So Shabbat changes your brain. Makes you more free. And consider prayer, regular structured prayer that interrupts. We talked about this, I think, was it a few weeks ago, that interrupts familiar neural pathways and redirects our attention toward God rather than our unconscious patterns. You're in an anxiety loop, rehearsing the things of the past or the things that might be in the future, and you're paralyzed, and you stop and you go to God in prayer. You're breaking that neural pathway and creating a new one. In that redirection, we become more free. In the Torah, God is asking us to wake up to who He is, to who He's shaping us to become. So imagine the mind as a river flowing in one direction. Free will is the ability to interrupt that flow and carve out a new stream. And the more we practice this, the more skilled we are at becoming, at reshaping every different area of our life. There's a rabbinic parallel that echoes Yeshua's teaching on the narrow path. This Talmud compares the world to a letter Hey. A Hey looks like this, with a little opening and an opening at the bottom. And then it compares the world to come to a Yud. Yud is like the little apostrophe-like letter. Okay. The world is like a letter Hey because it's wide at the bottom, and the currents of life easily carry us downward. Yet there's a small opening at the top for those who choose to turn back to life. The world to come is like a Yud because it's so small and those who find it are few. God has given us a right way in life and a wrong way in life. And there's lots of gray areas and things like that, but when it's all sorted down and comes down to the boiled down, there's a right way and there's a wrong way. He's given us the ability to crystallize ourselves one way or the other. Enter through the narrow gate. Narrow is the gate and difficult the way that leads to life, and few find it. The way of life requires work. And without that inner work, we simply remain asleep. Yeshua is placing before us the ultimate expression of free will, the slow accumulation of choices that shape who we are, who we will become for eternity. And then Yeshua ends our Besorah with an image. Those who hear His words and act on them are like the one who builds a house on a rock. Storms come and it stands, but those who hear and do not act on them are like building on sand. The storm comes and great is its fall. Pharaoh built a house on sand. Whether we joined Pharaoh at the bottom of the sea or Moses on the other side of it, is shaped long before the water closes. After all is sifted and sorted out, there are two kinds of people. Those who wash away like sandcastles in the surf as the tide comes in, and those who act on God's gift of freedom and build something that lasts forever. The rock, Yeshua tells us, is not a single dramatic decision as much as the daily direction of our heart. The thousands of small choices, some larger, some smaller, that seek the kingdom of heaven above all else. And later in the Besorah of Yochanan, Yeshua makes a striking claim about the narrow bridge itself. He says, I am the gate, the way. I am the bridge. If anyone comes in through me, he will be saved. So out of the countless paths and choices that shape us into real human beings, the most decisive direction is to trust him and to follow him and to let his life become our own. Because he is the way of eternal life, the way of the kingdom of heaven, and the way of ultimate freedom. Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Of the house of Israel, in the mouths of the people, in the mouths of the house of Israel, and may your descendants and the descendants of your people Israel be those who know your name and study your Torah for Messiah's sake.